Hello everyone and welcome. In this video, we'll talk about portals in Corona for Cinema 4D. We're going to be talking about what they are, how do they work, and how we can properly place them. So without being around the bush too much, let's dive straight into it. Alright, so portals tell Corona how to sample light more efficiently, which helps in getting rid of image noise much faster than by just randomly sampling the whole scene. So in front of us, you'll see that we have a couple of different rooms that I've prepared. They're really basic, but that will make it a little easier to convey certain ideas. You can also see that we have a sky in here that's driving our lighting, and the sky has a Corona light material with an HDRI applied to it. Now, each room has a window opening. If I jump into my camera A here, then B, and then C, you'll see that the window openings are of different sizes. And that's because the way portals work, you'll see the biggest gains in rendering speed when you have smaller window openings. And so obviously, that will help us get our point across a bit better here. Broadly speaking, if you have multiple big-sized windows in your interior, then portals won't be as efficient. As a matter of fact, in certain scenes where you have really large window openings, the performance might actually be worse. So, let's not talk about it too much and let's do some testing. I'll hide my other rooms here. And then I'll start rendering from camera C. Now a quick note, if I open up the render settings, you'll see that we're using path tracing for the primary solver and the UHD cache for our secondary GI solver. To make these tests more accurate, we'll be limiting the renders with a time limit set to 15 seconds. The reason for us going with the time limit setting here is because using portals, the number of passes sometimes will be less or more than what you'd otherwise get without portals. Setting a noise limit would result in a similarly arbitrary result. So let's just stick with the time limit as our end of render parameter here. Alright, let's render this bad boy out. After 15 seconds, the render is quite noticeably noisy. So let's save this image into our history list here. Whoops, let me just delete these previous ones. Let's save it. And now let me enable my portal for this room here. And don't worry, we'll go over how to properly place portals a bit later. We're just doing some tests right now. So let's render this one out again, this time with the portal in there. Sweet. I can already tell that the image is a lot less noisy than it was before. But let's not be just ordinary internet heroes. Let's take a look at that history list and compare the two renders. So on the right, we have our render with the portal turned on, and on the left, without the portal. Alright, so obviously the image with the portal is a lot less noisy. Just take a look at this area here. Cleaned up way better than it did on the other render without the portal. So that's portals 1, no portals 0. Quite a big difference. Alright, with that done, let's continue with these tests and let's move on to the other rooms. So let me just get everything set up. And this one is ready to go. Let's render. Alright, you'll see that our second room here has a bit bigger window opening. We're getting a lot more illumination from the HDRI in the room, and the noise after 15 seconds, well, it isn't that bad really. Still, let's render a version with the portal being in place and turned on. Before that, let me just quickly save this image into our history list. Yeah, there we go. And turn on the portal, and let's render this one out again. Great, it finished. And now let's compare the two. Yeah, definitely a difference that says that even in this particular interior, a portal sure helps. The difference is quite noticeable, as you can see. Now, some of you have probably noticed something off in the timestamp here. If you'll remember, we've set our render time to be 15 seconds, but this is showing 19 seconds. Let me go into my stats tab here, and you'll see that the actual rendering here took exactly 15 seconds. That being said, we had some pre-computational phases, like the UHD cache pre-comp, that took 3 seconds, and just know that those are exempt from the actual render time, so even though our total is 19 seconds, the render actually took exactly 15. So consider that a quick tip, if you will. Right, let's move on with our testing. Let's go into room A here. Room A actually has the biggest window opening, as you can see. And so let's just render this bad boy out. So as you can see, as we already mentioned, the window opening for this particular interior spans the entire wall here. It's a fairly large window opening indeed. Let's save this image into our history list. And let's render it with the portal turned on so that we can again compare between the two options. So if we again compare the before and after images here, well, you'll see that even in this particular case, the portal is again noticeably helping in cleaning up the noise rather well. So this would be another good example of how the portals can help you with your render times. If we zoom in here, you can see the difference a bit better. One interesting tidbit though, take a look at the number of passes in each of these two images. So Corona completed 22 passes for the render with the portal off, and it completed 13 passes for the render with the portal on. Now take a look at the noise. The noise is actually less noticeable in the render with the portal on, but the number of passes is actually lower than in the other render that doesn't have the portal enabled. So that's a very important thing to remember, because sometimes your passes won't match between the renders when you render with or without the portals. So you need to take that into the account when you're using a pass limit to stop your render. Now, again, portals require getting used to them. Certain scenes will really benefit from them even if they have relatively large window openings. Other scenes can potentially see a downgrade in performance, but as a rule of thumb, if it's a smaller window opening and you only have a couple of windows, chances are the portals will be helping you in getting out a cleaner render faster. Now, let's talk about how portals actually work. We are still in the same scene as before, but while I wasn't recording, I've created this hemisphere here. Now it looks a bit crazy like that because what I've done was I actually extruded the vertices of the hemisphere outward. But now that's really besides the point here. Hear me out. What this hemisphere represents is what happens when a ray shoots from the camera and hits a spot on the floor here. From that point forward, the rays can bounce in a lot of different directions, and so that's what these lines represent. Corona obviously needs to calculate all of what's going on here, and as you can imagine, it's a pretty computationally intensive thing to do. Now, out of all these rays, only a percentage of them actually sample the HDRI, which in our case is our main lighting source. Let me demonstrate what I mean. I'll select the sphere, and I'll try to roughly select all the rays that shoot outwards towards the window opening. So something like this maybe. Perhaps I could even select these guys here. Sort of roughly like this. Right. So as you can see, out of a bunch of rays, only like 25% or something, only those rays will transport the light into the scene. Now, observe what happens if I take this sphere and move it into the smallest room here, or better yet, the room with the smallest window opening. I'm just going to select the sphere and move it in place, sort of like this. And back to point mode we go. Well, obviously now all of these selected quote unquote rays, we need to select them again because the window opening is much smaller. So I'll do that real quick. So maybe if I just select these guys here, not these, whoopsie, these guys here, maybe this is representative enough. Alright, so you can clearly see, if before it was something like 25% of all these rays that sampled the HDRI, well, now in this small room, it's only a small handful of them. And so obviously, that means that the environment light has a harder time reaching the inside of the room and properly illuminating it. Don't get me wrong, the light still gets in here, and the result is accurate, but the computational power that's needed is much higher. And so the render is slower. Corona basically repeatedly samples that particular spot where the hemisphere is and gets a lot of samples from inside the room. And because the window opening is so small, only a few of those rays are getting the light information from the environment light, which is the only thing illuminating the room here. Alright, so that's the gist of how portals work in general. Now let's talk about how we actually use portals. For that, let's just reset our scene here. And we're back in action. So, how do we actually place portals in our scenes? Well, believe it or not, placing portals in Corona is very straightforward, and you just need to abide to some simple rules. The general idea is that we need to create a thin plane of geometry that will perfectly cap the window hole from the outside. Then we apply a Corona portal material to it, and we're done. So let's do that. There are multiple ways of creating a perfect cap for the window hole here. One of my favorite ways is to get your polygon pen tool out. So if we go under Mesh, Create Tools, Polygon Pen, and if I turn on Snapping, make sure it's set to Vertex Snap, well, now I can just draw a polygon around my hole here. So like this. Perfect. Now, if I go into the polygon mode, keep my polygon selected, you'll see that the normal is actually pointing outward instead of inward. Now, in Corona, that really doesn't matter, but I would still recommend reversing the normals because, well, it's just good practice in general, you know, to have things pointing in the right direction. So I'll just right-click it and reverse the normal here. There we go. And now you can see that it's facing inward. Now, a quick note here, your portal geometry can be made up of multiple polygons as well. It doesn't really matter with Corona, but it's just good practice and obviously scene management as well, if you keep it as low poly as possible, okay? Right, so here we go. This is the perfect portal, if you will. Now the only thing we need to do is, we need to create a portal material and apply it to our freshly created geometry. So I'll go under Corona here, and I'll create a portal material. Next, what I'll do is, I'll just apply it to my geometry, and obviously, good scene management rules, I'll rename it to be called Portal B. And that's it. That's your perfect portal for this room. Now another quick tip, if I may. When you have the portal material selected, you get a nice little message here, giving you an outline of some of the things that you should and shouldn't do. So make sure you read that. Great. So now let's take a look at some incorrect positions of the portal geometry. One slightly less optimal position would be if we'd push the portal a bit more towards the inside. So, like this. This way, the portal still perfectly fits the hole, obviously, but it doesn't perfectly cap the hole from the outside, because now it's pushed inwards a little bit. This positioning generally shouldn't cause any problems. It's less optimal, so the noise reduction is a bit hindered, but it's still passable. Try to avoid it though and just place the portal so that it perfectly caps the hole from the outside. So to fix it, in this case, I would probably just need to snap it back into place. So like this. Right, so that's one slightly less optimal portal position. Now, if we were to push our geometry outside of the hole, like this, a little bit more towards the exterior, this would not be an optimal position. Because if I jump into my camera view here, you'll see that there is a small gap here where the portal isn't aligned and we see the outside. This is, again, not an optimal position at all, and you must fix it. By keeping this portal placement, you might actually get slower noise reduction, not faster. Similarly, if we make the portal smaller, this obviously also isn't optimal at all. Positioning a portal like this will cause performance issues, and you should definitely avoid it. Now, contrary to such a position, if we make the portal bigger than the window hole, so like this, and even if the portal is still slightly outside the actual window opening, like this perhaps, well, this positioning is okay. It's not the most optimal, as the noise reduction will take a small hit, but it will still speed up the rendering process. Great. Now, to demonstrate another bad portal position, let me just undo a couple of our moves so that our window is back into its perfectly window capping position. Now, if I place this portal on the inner part of the window hole, so like this won't work great because you have important geometry behind the portal, so that's the actual window. You'll get slower noise reduction and might even run into a couple of issues with the lighting. Definitely always try to perfectly cap the window hole from the outside. That is the most optimal way of doing things. Now, there is one more important thing that I want to bring your attention to. And so if you're doing interiors or similar scenes, so perhaps something like this scene here, this room here, well, you don't necessarily have to cover all the window openings with portals. If in this example you just place a portal on just one of the windows, for example this window, and not this one, well, in this case the portals would still work and you would still get some speed up in noise reduction because Corona portals act more like a hint for the render engine so that it knows in which direction it should sample more. In some other renderers, portal lights act more like area lights that are mapped with the color of the environment that's behind them. That's not the case in Corona. Do note one important thing though. Portals that are not relevant to the current room will still take away processing power, so it is best to only have portals active that are relevant to the current room. So in this example, disable portals in room A and B when rendering room C, whether or not room C has its own portal enabled. It is not a huge difference in processing power, but do keep that in mind. Alright, we've got that down, and now let's move to a real production scene and put in some portals. The scene we'll be working with is a quick personal project of mine based on a real-world reference photo found online. Unfortunately, I don't know the author, but if you ask me, the room is very neatly designed. If I fly around a bit, you'll see this is just your typical scene, and it's made up only for a few angles because our camera is standing right there and there's really nothing behind it. On the outside, this is looking very primitive, but as you can see, we've got an exterior building and a tree, just, something for the background. There is one single sky dome in here, which has a Corona light material with an HDRI applied to it. That is our main lighting, although we do have some interior lights in here as well. All in all, very simplistic, really. So I've already rendered out a preview without any portals. This is how it looks like after exactly 2 minutes of rendering. A ton of noise everywhere, yes, but that's by design because you will see the difference when we turn on portals more clearly this way. Alright, let's go ahead and let's place our portals in here, shall we? These are my window holes. I think I'll do this my way, and I'll use the polygon pen tool. So first of all, the first portal. I'm just going to start creating my mesh. And I really need to make sure that the points are snapped exactly in place so that they cover the window hole perfectly, because that is the most optimal way to place portals. So this one's giving me a hard time, but I managed. And here we go. This is our first portal. Now I'll actually split my geometry here so that we have two portals, but ultimately this could have been just a single mesh. Let me just do this real quickly here. Quickly but precisely. Just make sure I'm snapping to the right point here. And there we go. Now I am really into good scene management, so I'll also reverse the normals on our portals here. So that's one. And that's two. And what I'll also do is I'll just rename them. There we go. Now, again, do note that making sure that the portals have normals facing inwards, that's not really important. It's just good scene management. Now, with our portals done this way, where we have two meshes, I suppose alternatively we could also place one giant portal that covers both of the window openings, from the outside of course, and just make it slightly bigger than the hole. Like we've said before though, that would be slightly less optimal, so let's just stick with our perfect solution here. Well, great. With the mesh in place, all I have to do now is I need to apply the portal material to our portals. So let's do that real quick. That's one, and that's two. Awesome. Let's render this one out, and for that we'll just speed up the video here a bit. Okay, great. You can still see a lot of noise. I mean, this only rendered for 2 minutes, and the window openings are kind of relatively small, so noise is to be expected with such low render times. Now, if I compare the two images, you'll see that there are areas where a lot of noise actually cleared up pretty well. Take a look at this area here. That's quite a big difference. Now, other areas, they kind of didn't improve all that much. Still noisy, and that just goes to show you that even though maybe you'd expect a huge difference everywhere in this particular interior, because the window openings are relatively small, and so that would be fair to expect, but as we said before, portals sometimes help more, sometimes less. In this particular interior, they sure help, but only on certain surfaces. Even in such a case, portals are useful. With all that being said, you'll also notice some subtle lighting differences overall. Pay attention to this area over here. Now why is that? Well, because when using portals, Corona has a better idea of where the lighting comes from. It can tighten up the lighting a little bit. And so that's really important to know, because for these reasons, you should place the portals in your scenes as soon as you have your models ready and you're moving into the lighting stage. Again, that's very important to know, otherwise you might be in for a surprise here and there, depending on the scene. One extra thing, if you pay attention to the noise amount and the pass amount, there are subtle differences. So the render with the portals only completed 5 passes, but the noise amount was 9.21. The render without the portals completed 6 passes, but the noise was higher at 10.36. So, as you can imagine, that's quite a bit of a difference. And again, even in this scene, where there are areas where portals kind of didn't make a lot of difference, overall the portals still help the render times, because look at this area here and how much more clean it is. So that's pretty much it for this video. We hope you've enjoyed it and that you've learned something new about portals in Corona for Cinema 4D. Make sure that if you have any extra questions, you check out the help desk that we have online. As always, thank you for watching.